recording, and I'm going to let some people in. So here we go. Hello and welcome to Avid Reader and to our event this evening. Lovely to see all your faces. It is I was going to say it's a lovely night, but then I just glanced out to the courtyard here and saw that it was actually quite windy at this end of things. But in Brisbane, it's a bit chilly at the moment. I always do my weather report at the beginning of our events as people are arriving. It's a little bit chilly, so imagine yourself gathered together on the back deck at Avid, and you are huddling together against a slight chill and a slight breeze. But of course, in this strange new world, we are zooming over to Western Australia. So imagine that it's actually quite bright and sunny as well at the same time. It's like some kind of weird quantum thing where we are both day and night at the same moment. The earth really is round. So welcome everyone. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we live on in this area, the Yagara and the Turrbal people, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and to any other elders who are here today, and to also acknowledge that we are zooming out onto the lands of many different Aboriginal people, and I'd like to pay my respects to all of the Aboriginal people around Australia whose lands we are zooming out to as well. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and sovereignty was never ceded. So it's with great pleasure that I'm going to introduce you to Cass Moriarty, who's doing our conversation today. But before I do that, I'm going to tell you about the chat function. So we take our questions for the Zoom room by the chat function. And I'm going to put a link to the book of the moment just in the chat function. So if you find that link to the book, and there is a book that Cass is holding up.
Yeah.
And so you can actually purchase that book via Avid Reader through that link, and we will post that out to you, or you can come and pick it up in person. And letting just one more person in before I introduce Cass. So Cass Moriarty is the Master of Ceremonies tonight, and I will be reading the questions out to the group myself, but Cass will be leading the conversation tonight. And Cass Moriarty is the author of The Promised Seed and Parting Words. She is also a literary judge, a reviewer, and a regular interviewer for Avid Readers Zoom events. So everybody welcome Cass Moriarty.
Thank you so much, Chrissy. Welcome, everybody. It's so nice to see all your faces, a few familiar faces I can see, and probably some from Western Australia that are not so familiar. I wanted to start by saying that here at Avid Reader, we're all about supporting readers and writers and keeping the literary community connected. So if you enjoy tonight's event, please show your support for authors, publishers, and of course, booksellers by sharing over social media, recommending your favourites, and of course, by buying many, many copies of this book and whatever other books take your fancy tonight. If you'd like to keep up with the Brisbane literary mafia scene, you can tune in on the last Monday of every month as Chrissy and I chat to a legendary Queensland writer and discuss some great new Australian book releases. Next up is Trent Dalton on the 28th of October, so that will be one not to miss. I'm so pleased tonight to be in conversation with author, former journalist and news editor Monique Mulligan. Monique has many interests, including photography, cats, photographs of cats, and cooking, but not cooking with cats, I don't think. She's the author of 3 children's picture books, and her short fiction has been published in various anthologies. Tonight, we're here to talk about Monique's debut novel, Wherever You Go, a romantic story of a couple recovering from a terrible tragedy while attempting to rebuild their lives. The book opens with a quote by John Kabat-Zinn, "Wherever you go, there you are," which is more profound the more you think about it. In the book, Amy and Matt discover that you can't run from guilt, shame, and loss. They follow you wherever you go. Welcome, Monique. It's so nice to have you here.
And thank you to you, Cass, and to Avid Reader for having me. It's an honour.
So Wherever You Go explores darker themes of grief, loss and guilt, but it is also a beautiful story of romance, hope and redemption. So I thought we might start by asking you to introduce us to the two main characters, Amy and Matt, and describe sort of where they are in their lives when the story begins.
Sure. Well, Amy and Matt are a married couple in their late 30s. They are not in the best place in their marriage at the moment. They've had this tragedy happen to them 3 years earlier while they were travelling in Germany. And so now they're at this point of having a tree change. And they're coming to this tree change, this new town with very different perspectives. Matt wants to hopefully look at what's happened to them and try to rebuild what they had and move forward together. Amy just wants to put what happened behind her, pretend it didn't happen if she can, and just, start all over again as a new person. So, yeah, that gives you that idea, I guess, of who they are.
You do a really deep dive into their relationship in the book, and I think that many of the issues that you uncover will resonate with readers. What are some of the difficulties in their marriage, and what are the roles that each of them has sort of fallen into over time? I know that, in long-term relationships, we tend to adopt a certain role, and that's, that's the part we play.
I think Amy and Matt are a couple who genuinely love and care for each other, and certainly had a very strong relationship before they, this event happened. And I feel like that comes across through the story. But they've also as you say, fallen into these roles where Amy is just so lost and caught up in her own grief that she relies very heavily on Matt to be that rock and to carry her through everything. And he's not able to speak out for himself and his own needs, because he probably thinks that he's loving her the best by, being there for her and supporting her in that way. But he does come to that point where he starts to question this and say, this is actually hurting me. This is all at my own expense. I've got to do something about it. And that's really where we find them. He's already at the start of the novel starting to question her self-absorption and, inability to see past her own self.
Yeah, and I think, as I said, that really emotional depth that you get into in the story, I think that will resonate with a lot of people, that sort of forensic examination of relationships and how they work.
Yeah, one of the things that a couple of people have commented on is that you'll be reading a chapter from Amy's perspective and thinking, yeah, I really understand what she's saying. And then you read it from Matt's perspective and you're like, yes, I really get what he's saying. And that made me really happy to hear that people could see that both sides were there. It wasn't just that I was favouring one, but you could really see those two different viewpoints very clearly.
Yeah. So the opening prologue of the book is a short scene in a hospital room set 3 years before the main story. It's a sharp, visceral, traumatic scene that tells us just enough to really worry us, but it doesn't give away any of the details. It's a really fantastic opening, so congratulations on that. It really hooks the reader in. Did you start with that scene, or is that something that you wrote later in the process of working through the novel?
Oh, that's such a good question. Thank you. It's definitely not the scene I started with. I always started with the first few lines that you see in the next chapter where they're driving into town. And it was probably about 2 years ago, almost to the day, when I was on a writing retreat, and Jen McLeod was at this writing retreat, and she was reading over this first probably 3 or 4 chapters. And she said, I think you need something else, something punchy, to really get the readers to this particular point. And so I went home after that retreat and I just hammered out this so quickly. You know, it took me maybe an hour and I had it done. And just with a bit of fine tuning, that has really remained unchanged ever since. So
it's only a couple of pages, but it's really, it's a great way to start the book.
Yeah, thank you.
So as you say, we've got the two main narrators in the book, Amy and Matt, and we do see things from both of their perspectives, which, as you say, is actually really helpful, because we can totally sympathise with Amy's point of view, and then in the next chapter we're totally sympathising with Matt, so we're sort of going between the two. The third narrator in the book is an older woman, Irene. Tell us about Irene's circumstances as the book opens.
Irene is a 69, nearly 70-year-old woman who is the next door neighbour of Amy, and when we meet her, she's starting to think about her dreams of travelling. She's always sort of wanted to do that, but she's the kind of person who's always been a carer, always looked after her daughter, her granddaughter, and her husband, and never done anything for herself. So now's her chance to actually put it, her dreams and her money to use and go travelling. And of course, it's not going to be that easy for her. And she's thrown this curveball that she completely doesn't expect. It comes from her granddaughter, who she raised her granddaughter. So her granddaughter throws this curveball at her. And the next thing you know, she's not going travelling anywhere. I just love the character of Irene. She's a great character. Yeah.
And I hope we can talk about Ashley. So Ashley is also a pivotal character.
Yeah.
So tell us a bit about her and why she's so important, not only to Irene but also to Amy.
Ashley is a 4-year-old girl who lives with Irene and her mother Bonnie, and she is a really chatty little feisty little thing who knows what she wants, and she lives.
So she's sorry to interrupt, but she's Irene's great granddaughter.
Irene's great granddaughter, yeah. So she sort of just inserts herself into Amy's life. She just turns up one day and asks for a cup of Milo, and she keeps on doing this and pushing her way into Amy's life. And of course, Amy doesn't really like this at first, doesn't really want to have a little 4-year-old coming over for reasons that are clear quite quickly. And Ashley is just insistent on doing this. And so her role is really, she adds that lightness to the book, I think. She makes you laugh because she's just got this little way about her. And I had so much fun writing her character. It's just, she's, I don't know, I just want to cuddle her. But she's also really important because she teaches Amy some really big lessons that Amy's, probably wouldn't have learnt from anyone else.
I think that's probably true of all the characters. She teaches she teaches quite a few of the characters some big lessons. Yeah. She's a very, very smart little girl.
Yes. Yes.
So one of the other things that you've done really well in this novel is to examine the minutiae of small town life. So we've got the gossip, the busybodies, everyone knowing everybody else's business, the rumour mill, the way that everyone is connected in some way, either through work or marriage or the fact that they're neighbours. I wanted to ask you what you find so fascinating about small towns, and what advantages do you gain as an author by setting a novel in a small community?
Well, that's a really good question. I think small towns have always fascinated me because I'm a girl of the suburbs. I grew up in the suburbs of Western Sydney, and now I live in the suburbs of Perth, and I yearn to live somewhere that is a smaller town. I've lived in regional towns. I lived in Albury-Wodonga for several years, and so I know what it's like to be in a slightly bigger town and not far from the country. But I've never lived in that really smallish town. And it does fascinate me because even though there's some stereotyped people you expect to see in those places, they actually are there. And, I was in the town where this book is set a couple of, probably 2 months ago. So the book was already written, and there's a character in the book called Frank, and I met a Frank. And Frank is actually, his name was Frank. And he was exactly like the Frank in this. It was very funny to meet him and say, oh, you're real, you're actually there. And if he ever reads this book, I wonder what he'll think of it.
Wow, that's really art imitating life, isn't it? Life really imitating art.
And his wife, and you'll get this, his wife's name was Jan. So yeah, and other readers will sort of see that later, but and she was, you know, just this lovely open-faced character. But these people do exist in these small towns, and I'm fascinated by them because, you know, I met someone in the town on the weekend. I did a talk in Bridgetown where the book is set, and she straight away introduced herself by what she does for the town. So Una does that. Una's the gossip in this book, and she says, you know, I'm the CWA president. Well, this woman, you know, was something else, and she, you know, that's how she introduced herself, and it was just very, I suppose, affirming. I'm like, yes, I was right. These people are real.
They really exist. Yeah, I think that's one of the strengths of the book is that we're not just focused on the main characters. There's a whole cast of characters, and they're all quite deeply examined or explored. You know, they're and even though they do have some stereotypical sort of characteristics, like you say, that's actually how it works in real life. So
it is. And they also have, you know, even with that I suppose that, you know, you might have that town gossip, but she's given her story as well. We don't go into it a lot, but she still has her story, and so does her daughter. And you see that, you know, there's actually that humanity to them. They're not just a caricature. They're a person who's maybe the way they are because of something else.
Yes. Yeah. And I think also that gives you the opportunity to insert quite a bit of humour into the book too, by using those characters, those sort of relatively minor characters. But there's some quite funny scenes that come out of their being in the book.
You need that humour in the book because it deals with so much grief.
Yes. I mean, you've got the love and the friendship as well, which balances the darkness, but then the humour just lifts it again, so that it's quite an uplifting book. Look, I wanted to talk about food because food is the absolute heart of this story. Tell us about the Around the World Supper Club.
Oh, where do I start with the Around the World Supper Club? It's actually a real thing.
Oh, really?
So, well, sort of. I was really, the character of Irene and her desire to travel came sort of from my own desire to travel because I was raising, you know, I had 4 teenagers in the house when I first started writing this book, and really had in my head that I would be going to Italy. And I knew it was going to take a while, and you know, so my dream was Italy. So I started off by learning some Italian and then starting to cook these Italian feasts. And I thought I wanted to really cook as authentically as I could. So I just started to make these feasts, and we'd have the music. I'd play Italian music in the background, and I'd have, you know, as much as I could to make it authentic without being in any way Italian. So, and then I started to have French feasts and started to have, you know, I had a Greek feast and so on. And, you know, I would even have to have the right type of dishes if possible. So for my Indian ones, I had those Indian dishes with the copper, you know, the heated ones. And even played Bollywood music, which didn't last. That got taken off very quickly. So the idea of the Around the World Supper Club came from that reality and from that desire to travel and deciding that I would just travel vicariously until I could. And how, like, ironic is it that right now we can't travel where we want to, and it's sort of like, here's my marketing point, isn't it? You know, it's like, you can't travel, but hey, you know, just read this and it will transport you to different countries around the world.
And it really does. I think when you're reading, you can tell that you're a complete foodie. The mouth-watering descriptions of the food are glorious, and what shines through is your devotion to the whole process. So the menu planning, sourcing the ingredients, cooking, serving, consuming the food, as you said, the whole, you know, the music and the plates and everything has to be right. I didn't realise you actually were doing that in real life. I thought that was just in the novel, but that's even more interesting that you're doing that yourself. So what first sparked your interest in food then?
I think I've always liked food, and years ago when I was younger, I wanted to cook at home, and my mum didn't like me cooking. Mum was very, very tidy, and that's something I've picked up from her, but she loved everything just so. So I wasn't allowed to cook, and she never really taught me to cook. So I had to learn it at school. And when I was about 16, I just said, you know what, I'm just going to cook a cake and I'm going to have it cleaned up before Mum gets home. And I tell you, she walked in the house and she looked around. She's like, I can smell cake, you know, and then you can just see her looking for the mess, but it was spotless, you know, I cleaned it up and there's this cake sitting there. So there's always been that part of me that's been interested in cooking, but over the years I've become more interested in cooking more varied things, I suppose. It's just something, you know, I love to travel to places and try the food as much as I can. I don't want to eat to get sick, but I want to try different things, and that's just something I guess I built into that story. Yeah.
So you mentioned that at home in real life you've tried Italian and Greek. What are some of the other cuisines that Amy experiments with in the book?
So she cooks Moroccan food in the book, and I do that as well. I have my tagine. It's actually one of the favourite things that we cook is Middle Eastern foods, and I don't so much go out as all out as I did in those days. I think my kids thought I was a bit obsessed, but they ate everything anyway. But they also cook there's Vietnamese as well. That's probably the one cuisine I didn't cook as much of. I feel like I can go to a Vietnamese restaurant and they just cook it so much better than I can. There's a lot of, you know, it's very quick work doing that. I tend to be much more of a slow cooker. So I like that slower process of, say, the Moroccan cooking, because you put it all into the tagine and put the lid on and just let it simmer, and, you know, it fuses these flavours together in such a deep way that I just love eating that. But cooking the fast things, it flusters me a little.
So what would you say is your favourite dish? In
the book or altogether?
Are you personally?
Oh.
Now that I know that the Around the World Supper Club is an actual thing, I'm asking you personally.
I don't know if I could possibly pick a favourite food, but I think my favourite cuisine is probably a Middle Eastern cuisine. Yeah, I really come to love the flavours of it, and yeah, it's just so much complexity to it. It used to be Italian, but now I would say Middle Eastern.
You've moved. So in the book, how does Amy use the preparation and serving of food as a tonic for her soul?
There's a scene where she's making bread, and she just finds that to be really relaxing and comforting, that whole process of kneading the bread. And so for her, it's a means to lose herself, I think, and to distract herself from problems, because she's got to focus so much on there. So it's a tonic in some ways, but it's also, you know, a way, I suppose, what's the word? I've just lost it now, but
like an escape,
defense mechanism, you know, for her. It's just, she just says, right, I'm just going to do this because then I don't have to think about that. But she also uses it as a way to show that she cares about people, and she's not able to use her words quite so well. So, you know, she'll make Matt a lemon meringue pie, for example, and there's a lovely scene there which you'll remember, which leads to quite some humour. And she, you know, she does that because she realises she's neglected him, and then in that moment she has enough awareness to say, I've got to do something for my husband, and I'm going to make him something he really loves. And yeah, that's her ways.
Yeah, every scene, I think, containing food in the book is intertwined with friendship, with community, with developing relationships with others, sharing stories over the acts of eating and drinking. Why do you think food plays such an important role in our lives, so much more than just physical nourishment?
I think it's just that food draws people together and it brings them to a common place. You know, we all need that food in order to survive, but it can bring you to that place where you gather and you talk and stories can come out if you allow yourself to be open to that. And I dream of having the long table and having the lights and imagine myself sitting in Tuscany, you know, on a hill with that table with the white tablecloth and the lights twinkling and the food just coming out and the wine flowing. And to me, that sounds like a heaven, you know, just to sit there with people and just talk. And yeah, I just think food brings that out in people. Not always, not with teenagers, because they eat it and they go. So,
that is so true.
Yeah.
Hours of preparation and it's gone in 5 minutes.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and it's complained about or it's dissected. So,
yes, I hear you. Yes,
yeah.
that's a problem. Monique, do you have some other favourite novels by other authors that use food in the same way as you have used it in this book?
There's a few. I mean, I've always loved Chocolat by Joanne Harris. That one is, you know, I watched the movie, I read the book and the books that followed that one. And there's just something about it, the way she talks about food and about chocolate that is just so sensual. It's beautifully written. Like Water for Chocolate. Then there's one I just read. It's The School of Essential Ingredients, and that one's lovely. And I've got a whole bunch actually right down there. There's a whole lot of foodie fiction on my shelf. Books by
inspired by those other authors, I think, because I certainly noticed some comparisons when I was reading your book to those.
Yeah.
You know, is that a genre? I don't know.
Look, foodie fiction could be. I mean, there's
foodie fiction
as well, who's more, you know, on the more commercial side, and I really like her work as well. And I think any book where food plays a really central role is probably foodie fiction in that sense. So I'm happy to stick to that. And you've paid me a huge compliment. So
yeah, foodie fiction, great.
Yeah.
Now, I'd like to ask about Pandora's box.
Mm-hmm.
And you can choose to answer either literally or figuratively or metaphorically. So you can give away as much or as little as you like about Pandora's box in the story.
Well, I think the theme of boxes is quite, it goes through the story quite a bit in multiple ways. You know, Amy and Matt move into a town and they're unpacking boxes because they've moved, you know, relocated. And then there's another scene where there's a box that contains something that really upsets Amy at that particular point and leads to quite a source of tension between them. So, I mean, we all know that, I guess there's that story that you open the Pandora's box and what's going to come out. So I did deliberately want to include that, although I didn't choose the name Pandora for that reason. No. I don't know why. Yeah, I just chose the name Pandora. It came to me. And then a bit later, it was like, oh, that's interesting. So, yeah, it wasn't a deliberate, maybe more of a subconscious
thing.
Yeah. And even like the writing of boxes through the story, it wasn't something I deliberately said, oh, I must write this in and have, you know, boxes every few chapters. That's important. It's just something, I don't think you do plan that, do you, when you're writing? You can sometimes just hit on a particular motif and it will follow through. So Pandora, I guess it's no secret, you can sort of tell by the cover that Pandora is the daughter of Amy and Matt, and unfortunately they lose her, and this is where the grief and the guilt comes from, is losing their daughter.
And Amy and Matt deal with that grief in very different ways, as we said at the start of this conversation. How would you describe that they each cope or don't cope with their grief?
It's, you know, isn't it one of those questions you ask yourself when you hear these kinds of stories and you think, how would I act if I did that, if that happened to me? Or you look at somebody else who's grieving and you think, how would they act? And I think with with Amy, it's like she's just become stuck in this denial. She's so consumed by both grief and guilt that she can't see anything but that. So she chooses to block it and to do everything else but deal with that. With Matt is dealing with it in a very different way, and perhaps, you know, at the outset it might seem like he's dealing with it in this stoic man way, but actually that's not how he wants to deal with it. And you discover as the story goes on that he is a lot more open about his feelings, just not with Amy, because Amy won't let him.
And also, I think because he wants to protect her.
That's right.
That's his role. He sees that as his role.
His role is to protect her and to support her. She's obviously, you know, what happened to her, and she was injured. What happened to her needed a lot of support anyway. So he was called on to give that support and had to kind of step up. But it's led to that incomplete grief for him because he's never been able to deal with it himself.
So even really at the beginning of the book, their relationship has sort of crumbled a bit to the point where Matt gives Amy an ultimatum fairly early on, which forces her to rethink her past and sort of take some decisive action. And as we were talking about earlier, you hold a microscope so closely to their thoughts and feelings throughout the book. As readers, we really easily sympathise with each of them, even though they're at odds with each other, but we can really see both sides. How did you get that balance right between the two main characters and enabling the reader to really empathise with each of them?
I think it was really important to me that Matt's perspective came across as equally as Amy's, although she has more chapters in the book. I actually looked at them today and thought, gee, she does have a lot, you know, of the book. But his chapters hold so much weight because there's so much in them, you know, of what he's thinking. He's a thinking man. He is an articulate man, even if he can't say what he needs to. And I just really felt like I had to get that across. So in the earlier versions of this book, Matt was always the protector. He was always there for her, but he was also a lot less likely to say how he felt. And so, you know, he sort of kept on accepting how she was behaving until he really started to fall apart. In this version, he's got more agency. He stands up for himself a little bit more. Sometimes he, you know, tells her, no, I don't like what you did there, or you're only thinking of yourself, or something like that. And that feels so much more authentic, this version of Matt. You know, I needed to do that. The feedback I've got from men who've read this book, they've really appreciated that his story has so much weight, and, you know, that it's, I don't know, they've really liked his character and the way he develops. So that's meant so much to me to know that.
Yeah, I think he's very, you know, you look at him very deeply, and he's, as the book unfolds, you understand him a lot more. And as you say, what you think is him coping in a particular way, you come to understand it's actually very different to that, how he's really feeling. And how he expresses that. So, yeah, that's done really well. It's not only Matt and Amy who are suffering in this book, but many of the characters in the story are grieving or have experienced a loss of some kind. Again, without giving too much away, I wondered if you could tell us about one or two of the other kinds of grief that you write about and how the various characters deal with it.
I suppose the obvious one is losing somebody through them dying. And so there are different characters who experience that at different times of their life. And then there's that grief of a relationship perhaps not working, and there's the grief of lost dreams, you know, things that you've had to let go of. And then there's even, I suppose, side by side to that, there's the guilt, because guilt is explored sort of almost equally in this, where different characters, they're sort of always wondering, did I do enough? Could I have stopped this from happening? You know, was I good enough parent? And those kind of questions come up for many of the characters as well. And sometimes very, very small ways, but just enough to make you realise it's all around us. You know, everyone we know has lost something or someone, and grief isn't just about somebody dying, and grief is what we're all going through now when we can't live the way we're used to living. You know, it's when we're hearing that people have lost their homes due to these fires that were sort of raging across different states earlier in the year, and straight from that into this pandemic that just doesn't want to let go. And it's just such an interesting thing, because you sometimes think grief is so narrow, but it's not. It's just so wide, and we all experience it so differently.
Yeah, and the book does a really good job, I think, of that, of exploring grief in many different aspects and the way people cope or don't cope. I mean, you gave a perfect example earlier when you talked about Irene and her lost dreams. You know, she's got to this point in her life where she feels like finally she's you know, going to be free to travel and fulfill some of her dreams, and then something happens and she can't do that. And that's a kind of grief as well.
Exactly. Yeah, because we all have that too, don't we? We've all got those things that maybe we didn't get or we didn't achieve, and we wonder, you know, what could have been. And sometimes you can't maybe regret the choices that you made, because that might undo some really good things as well. But there's still those grief. I grieved when I couldn't have another child. You know, that was even though I had two beautiful young, you know, almost teenage boys at that time, just knowing that was it for me. I don't know, it hit me really hard. For about, you know, a day I cried, and I'm thinking, what is wrong with me? And I thought, oh, you're grieving changing from one stage of life to another. Yeah.
And a lot of the story, along with grief, is about self-forgiveness, from the grief, the guilt, the blame that goes along with that, and recovery from trauma. So what do you think is the takeaway message from the book about guilt and remorse versus optimism and redemption?
Oh, gee. I don't know about a versus thing almost. You know, I just think we need to be kinder to ourselves, and that's probably that message that, you know, each of the characters in here has that opportunity where they're not kind to themselves, but they need to do that, to realise that they are fallible, they're not perfect, and yeah, life is hard, and we're not always going to treat the setbacks in good ways, but let's be kind and forgive. But that's the kind of person I am, you know, but I'm really hard on myself as well. So I have that sort of duality of being quite optimistic and very forgiving towards other people, but geez, I'm hard on myself. And
I think that's quite, you know, that seems to be quite common, that the way you treat others is not the way you treat your own self and the own expectations that you have of yourself.
Yeah. So interesting way to think about it.
Yeah. And as readers, for people who haven't read the book, I think there's a lot there. There's a lot of meaty, sort of thought-provoking stuff to get you to get your mind thinking about those issues. Now, listen, I have heard a rumour that you are planning a companion cookbook, including all of the recipes from this story. Is that something that might happen, or is that just a rumour, a small-town rumour?
Oh, I don't know. I've had so many people say to me, you should do this cookbook. And I thought, oh, maybe I should do this cookbook. You know, if people want it, then just do it. And then I spoke with the person, one of my Kuyara Press team members, and she is a long-time editor and edited many, many cookbooks. And she said, oh, they're really hard. They're very, very difficult to do and to get all the conversions. And I'm thinking, oh, forget the conversions, just do the Aussie kind of ones.
Yeah, we don't need to.
But yeah, so then that kind of set me back a bit. And I thought, oh, maybe I shouldn't do that. Maybe that is a bit too hard. So haven't decided yet, but I haven't given up on the idea because I really like it.
I think it'd be such a great book. The trouble is there's so much competition with, I mean, there are so many cookbooks on the market, and they're also, you know, glossy and fabulous. But there's something about the recipes in this book and just the way that the process of them and the way that they're made and the reasons that they're made, that I think something could be done around that. Yeah, I like the idea.
Yeah, and I'd have a little bit of a story and a little bit of an explanation with each one, so it wouldn't just be recipe picture. You know, I love words. I'll have to put more words in it somewhere.
Absolutely, yeah. We're really talking about another novel.
Yeah, and that's right. And look, all the menus for this are on my website. So if anyone wants the menus, you can actually go and download them. There's recipes in the back of the book, a couple of them, and there's also one on my website. And you did mention before about cooking with cats, and I don't cook with them to eat.
You don't cook cats, I hope.
Definitely don't cook cats. But if you watch my Instagram or my Facebook page, I do cooking videos with my cat.
Oh, perfect.
And in one of them, it does look very much like she's sitting in the bowl.
But you can assure us that no cats were harmed in the making.
I actually had to pick up the bowl and show people. So no cats were ever harmed. She gets fed treats. So, yeah.
Oh, well, that's great to know about. I didn't know that about the website. I did see the recipes at the end of the book. There's only a couple, but that's great that we can look on the website and get more recipes, because I can guarantee people that once you read this book, you will want to make this food.
Yeah.
Now we're almost ready to see if we've got any audience questions. I'm just going to ask one more before we do that. And this was, how did you make the transition from children's author to writing a book for adults? And was that a difficult change?
That's one of those questions that could take ages to answer, but I'll try to be quick. I always wanted to be an author of a novel before I wanted to be a children's book author. I'd written some children's books years ago, back when my children were young, more to just read to them, and tried my hand at getting one of them published at one point, and it didn't happen. The opportunity came up for me, and I took that opportunity and got those books published, and that's been it was a fun experience. But my passion was always to write. That was my intention, was to write a book for adults. I like stories. I'm not a big romance reader. I prefer the what happens next. When the couple's been together for a while and throw some problems at them and see how they go, because that, to me, that's my reality. That's what I like to hear about. So the transition, though, to becoming that, I guess it was just a matter of sitting down. It's writing a lot more words. It's hard, I tell you. The whole process of writing it and rewriting and getting the draft to a point where you think you're really happy with it and you've got something, and then getting told that it's beautiful writing, but not enough happens, and you go, oh. What do you mean not enough happens? This is what happens to them. Did you not get that? And so you go back and you revise, and it was a long and painful process. I won't say it was a lot of fun, because I found it hard, because I so much wanted to do it. It meant the world to me to get it out there, and I really believed in the story, but it didn't come to me. You have to work for it. So, yeah.
Like cooking, much like cooking. There's a lot of prep and a lot of reworking and a lot of trial and error.
And that's it. I don't like fast food, and fast food doesn't like me. So, I can't. Definitely, I'm a slow cooker when it comes to writing.
Chrissy, do we have any questions for Monique from the audience?
We do indeed. And congratulations on the book. And I do intend to look up your recipes on your website. I do love a good recipe, so that will be fun. We have a question from Josephine, who says, congratulations, Monique. And did you deliberately balance the light and the dark, the humorous and the tragic as you wrote, or did you have to address that balance later?
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you, Josephine. It's I think that came to me fairly naturally, you know, just knowing that I had to have that lightness in there. And, you know, probably my natural fallback is going for humour to some point. So that part seemed to come in quite well. For me, the hardest part was actually writing in enough conflict in the story.
Yep. So that was difficult. The actually creating the conflict was the difficult part for you.
It was having it enough and having it layered enough. You know, I think there's having say the initial premise, couple has this tragedy and they move. Obviously there's conflict there, but it just wasn't at the forefront. And I needed to really work on that. And I found that was probably the most challenging part of writing the story, was really getting that conflict out there as much as I did.
I think it was interesting what you were saying before about the romance part of the story, which is obviously a big part of the story. But as you say, it's not a beginning romance. It's a romance that's quite established. And what I enjoyed was the emotional exploration of you know, a more established romance going through those conflicts and those challenges and obstacles, and how they deal with that, how they cope with that, how they get through that together, and still, you know, somehow at the other end are still, you know, together. So I think that was done really in a really interesting way, I think.
There's a question here from Sarah. Apart from the cooking, how much of you is in the characters? And are there any cats?
Thank you, Sarah. Yes, there is a cat in the book. And I'm not going to say too much about the cat because you'll find out about the cat, but it belongs to Ashley. There's, I suppose, when it comes to me, Amy is very different to me in personality. So while we share that love of cooking, she's probably a lot better at it than me because she's a chef, she's trained, she knows what she's doing. You know, doesn't have to kind of keep on checking the recipe and stuff like that like I do. But she is very, she holds herself back a lot. She's somebody who, when people sometimes they assume that she's like me, but then they realise that she's not. When you look at someone like Ashley, for example, I think Ashley is a bit like I was as a little girl. And then life made me quieter, except with people, like in small groups like this, you know, I can be quite chatty, but in life I became quieter and more reserved. But Ashley's this lovely little chatty child who runs up to people and just starts talking and telling them all about her mum and everything. And that's what I used to be like as a little girl. So I think I drew on, you know, the different memories my family told me about myself to create Ashley. When it comes to say Matt is probably the most like me. And that's the interesting thing, that I didn't even realise that until I finished the book, because I've lived through that kind of situation, not the same as Matt and Amy's, but I've been that person who's had to be the rock, to be that supporter, and to do it to the point where I thought I was going to lose myself. And the only way that I could get out of that, like to save myself, was to walk. So I know what Matt feels like, and I think that helped me to write him better.
Yeah, fair enough. And what about putting out a book in this particular moment? Because you've been wanting, you know, the whole time to write a book for adults as your kind of passion. And then, of course, when it comes time to put that book out, it's a very different experience to what you would have expected, probably.
It is. And I've been so fortunate, though, because I'm in Western Australia. So I was actually able to, by the time my book came out, I was able to have a launch party and have people come to that party and not just do it online. So I know that I'm really fortunate to have been able to experience that moment. And I've been able to go to some libraries and talk to people face to face. So in that sense, I'm much more fortunate than, you know, debut authors over East who can't do that. But on the other hand, September, like, what a time to pick to release a book when there's so many books. I heard at one point there was 400 or 600 books being released on, I think, the 1st of September. You know, what hope do you have of getting your book noticed when there's this flood of books because everybody's held off publishing them? You know, you just have to stick your hand up and hope someone notices you. But, you know, I just kind of figure my book is like my cooking. It's the kind of thing, it's there, and the scent of it will eventually, you know, it'll come out there and people will notice. They'll go, what's that book over there? And they might read it. So,
well, congratulations for getting your events online as well, because that's another wonderful way of sharing.
Yeah, it is.
We've got a question from Karen. Congratulations, Karen says, and I can't wait to read it. It sounds brilliant. Now that you've written this novel, do you find that there is another story waiting to be written? And have you started something else?
Thank you for that. And yeah, thanks for your kind words. I hope you do read it. It's a really funny thing because I've written 2 other manuscripts while I was writing this book. So while I was sort of at publishers and waiting to hear back, I wrote a manuscript which is set in about 1979, and it's a story of a young girl who sees or knows that her friend is in a situation where domestic violence is happening. But it's that time where everyone says it's none of your business. It's none of our business. We're not going to deal with it. The police won't do anything about it because it's a domestic. So that story is already written, but now it's time for me to revisit it and go back. And I want to add another timeline to that story. I think it needs that in there. And then I started writing a Gothic Australian sort of historical novel, which has got themes about lost children. Think of like Frederick McCubbin and the Blue Mountains. It's actually set in the Blue Mountains because I grew up in Penrith, not far from there. So I have that one at about 60,000 words, but then I've started a book to follow wherever you go as well. And I was working on the outline of that this afternoon.
I was going to ask if there's a sequel actually, because it sort of sets it. I mean, it's easily a standalone, but you can see a sequel happening.
It is, and I wrote an outline a couple of months ago, and it's really been niggling at me because there was something about it that I just thought, I don't think I can go there, I don't think it's right, but I wasn't sure what it was, and now I know what it is. And this particular character that was going to be in there, I believe he's actually been moved to the delete bin. I'm ready.
He's been voted off the island.
He's been voted off. Yeah. He actually wasn't really nice, and I think it's more that I don't think I want to go down that particular path. Yeah.
Really, it's been really, really fascinating. Cass, I might wind up there unless you had some other question that you wanted to ask.
I just wanted to quickly ask Monique about just before we started recording, we were talking about the sign that she's got in the background on her bookshelf. I wondered if she might share that with us. I think that'd be a lovely way to
finish. Okay, so the sign is here, but you might not be able to read it. It says, I see my path, but I don't know where it leads. Not knowing where I'm going is what inspires me to travel it. And it's a quote by Rosalia de Castro.
I love that.
Yeah.
That's a beautiful, a very inspirational thing to have be looking at while you're writing.
It is, and it's just one of those quotes that really meant something to me this year, because I tend to be a bit more of a pantser when I write, and so I don't have that plotted sort of outline there that I know today I'm working on this chapter and this is what's going to happen. And so it kind of mimics or reinforces how I write, which is I don't quite know how I'm going to get there, but that's the fun of it. Yeah.
Well, Monique, I just wanted to finish by saying to everybody that this is a really gentle and comforting story that explores some very confronting issues about grief and blame, but it does so in a really satisfying way and with a lovely sense of humour, fun and mischief as well. And I think that a lot of readers will fall in love with these characters. So congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
And hopefully it will stand up hold its head up against all that sea of hundreds of other books that are being published in September this year.
Yeah, I hope so. And I thank you so much for your questions. They were terrific questions, and also the ones from the audience. I thank you. And Chrissy, thank you and your team at Avid for putting this together. And, you know, someone you don't even know, and it's been wonderful to have that opportunity. Thank you.
We know you now.
You do now. Yes.
And look, at Avid Reader, we have spent a lot of time this year supporting debut fiction authors, and we certainly have a very special spot in our heart for the debut authors who have published in 2020. It has been the most difficult of years for a debut author, and we support all of you, and we really hope that your work does really well. I'm just putting the link up to it to underline that. But and yes, someone's clapping there. Maybe we can unmute people so that they can just do a final clap. So I'm just going to allow you to unmute yourselves. And thank you very much. It's been really great.
Thank you so much, Monique.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Lovely to see everybody.
See you later. Bye.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.